Close the door. Oh, sorry, I'll get it. This is what happens when you get coffee.
How do we know if we started?
We are.
We are.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, this is it.
Hello, my name is Don, and I'm here to talk about IELTS listening today. I'm going to answer your questions. So please write your questions in the column underneath, and Sarah here will begin by asking us a few questions to start off with. So Sarah?
Thank you, Don. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'll be asking Don some questions and reading out your questions for today. Okay, Don, to start off with, I have this question for you. How does IELTS test my English listening?
Well, Sarah, it's a good question.
Thank you.
My pleasure. The listening test is about 30 minutes long, and it has 4 different sections. It has a variety of accents, English accents, it has Australian accents, American accents, and others. And it has English spoken in a variety of situations. So that's basically how IELTS tests your listening. They ask you 40 questions, and you have to be able to answer those 40 questions about 30 minutes of listening.
Thank you so much, Don. I have another question for you. How is the listening test structured?
Well, the structure of the test is this. There are 4 sections, and the first section you will hear 2 people discussing an everyday topic. It might be something like organising a cup of coffee or organising going shopping. The second part of the test is one person giving some information of a general nature. And this person will probably be talking on the radio, or it might be some recorded information that you hear. The third part of the test is 2 or 3 or even more people talking. But this time they're talking in an academic context. So they might be talking about a seminar or a paper that they're writing for a university lecturer. And finally, the fourth part is listening to a lecture, which is quite complicated, but not too complicated. One person talking about a particular subject and giving some information about that subject.
That's great. Thank you, Don. Other question, what is the most difficult part of the test?
Well, many people think that the fourth part of the test, remember that's one person giving a lecture, is the most difficult. It probably is the most difficult in terms of the language that's used, and the content may be a little bit more difficult than in those other parts of the test. But of course, what is difficult and what is easy depends also on your experience. So you might be quite comfortable with listening to these sorts of lectures, and that may not be so difficult. You might find it more difficult listening to 2 or 3 people speaking, having a conversation. So I would recommend that you practice listening to all those sorts of English in order to prepare.
Great. The other question, give me some tips on how to prepare for IELTS listening to get the best score possible.
Right. Well, I just said you should practice listening to different types of English and different accents in English. So listening to one person, listening to a couple of people, listening to lectures. All of these things, of course, can be found on the internet. You can listen to lectures, you can listen to conversations. But one of the things that really will help you in your listening is knowing more words. So you really need to prepare yourself by systematically learning vocabulary. And when you learn vocabulary, of course, you learn it not just by listening to one word, but by listening to a word in context, so that you can understand the sorts of situations in which a word is used and the sorts of meanings that a word can have depending on the context. So improve your vocabulary, listen to different accents, and make sure that you use those words as well in your speaking and your writing. And all of those things will help you in your listening.
Thank you so much, Don. And don't remember, please, to write your questions on the comments below. I have a question for you, Don.
Yeah.
What listening practice does IELTS provide?
Well, if you go to our IELTS Essentials website, you'll be able to listen to some authentic listening parts of a listening test. There are also IELTS preparation materials, the official practice materials that you can also order online. You can get all of those. They have listening sections in them. And you can always go to our Facebook page as well, where there are lots of tips about all parts of the test, including listening.
Great. Another question.
Yeah.
How does IELTS mark my English listening?
Well, as I said before, there are 40 questions in a listening test, and this means that you have to get about 30 of these questions correct to get a band 7. Now, when you answer these questions, you have to make sure that you spell your answer correctly, because if you don't, that will be marked wrong. You have a chance, 10 minutes at the end of the listening test, to transfer your answers to your mark sheet. So be very careful when you put your answers down on the mark sheet that they are spelt correctly, that they are in the right order, that you write clearly, because if it's not written clearly, the examiner won't be able to give you a score for that. So that's how we score your listening test.
Great. First question I have it from Anil.
Yeah.
Anil asking, I don't think IELTS academic and general varies in the exam.
Anil said, I don't think IELTS academic and general varies. That's exactly right, Anil. In the listening test and also in the speaking test, academic and general training are exactly the same. So if you're doing an academic test, it's exactly the same as if you are doing a general training test for the listening and also for the speaking.
Great. We're still waiting for another questions.
While we're waiting for some more questions,
Mm-hmm.
let me just also mention that with the listening test, I mentioned before that you have 10 minutes to transfer your answers onto the mark sheet. That means that you should use your pencil very freely, marking keywords on the question sheet, making little notes, underlining things, stars and all that sort of stuff, in order to predict the answers that you might hear, and also to listen for key words in the listening test, because this is a skill that you really need.
Another question. Thank you so much, Don, for that. Another question. What accent is the question in?
Well, as I said before, you get a variety of accents in the listening test. Remember, IELTS is the international English language testing system. And that means, of course, that the questions are written in all English-speaking countries. They might be written in Australia or in the UK or in America. And the people who perform on the listening test also come from these places. So you might hear an Australian accent like mine, or you might hear an English accent, you might hear a Scottish accent, a New Zealand accent, an American accent, or a Canadian accent. All of these accents will appear at various stages during a listening test.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. And how can I prepare for listening?
Well, as I mentioned before, one of the best preparations is to improve your vocabulary. But in this day and age, there is a lot of English out there that you can listen to. So really, IELTS is a test that ranges very widely across all sorts of English situations. So if you like listening to music, for example, listening to songs, if you like watching movies, do that. Go to the internet, listen to lectures, because that's something that you'll need to practice for the IELTS listening test. Also listen to people that you meet. Talk to people in shops, talk to people at the bus stop. Remember, this is a very important thing. The more that you speak English, the more you will hear English. If you go shopping and don't say a word, no one is really going to talk to you in English. But if you begin speaking more and more and more in English, then you will start hearing more and more English as people respond to what you say.
Great, thank you so much. Another question from Anil.
Yeah.
Could you explain marking?
Well, I did mention that the marking system is basically 40 questions. If you want to get a band 7 in listening, you'll need about 30 correct answers. The marking is done by someone who has a list of answers, and they are looking at the list of answers and then looking at your list of answers on the mark sheet. Now remember, spelling is important. Your writing is important. If you don't write clearly, then that will be marked as a wrong answer. You need to make sure that you follow the instructions. If they say no more than 2 words, don't write 3 words, because that will be marked as wrong as well. But basically, the answers come in the same order as they do in the recording. So if you hear the answer to question number 20, you know that the question number 21 and 22 will be coming soon after that. So that's basically how you are marked.
Great. I have a question from Anat. How much for materials if I order it online?
That's a very good question, and I can't answer it, to be honest. You'll find out very soon if you go online to IELTS Essentials or IELTS.org. You'll find that they are advertised on those websites. And as I recall, they are not that expensive. It's something in the realms of $20 or $30 for the official practice materials. But go to the website and find out.
Thank you, Don. Ragdoll has a question as well. How can I improve speaking?
Well, improving speaking is something that really requires you to look at the 4 assessment criteria that you are assessed on in speaking. And those criteria are your fluency, your vocabulary, lexical resource, your grammar, grammatical range and accuracy, and your pronunciation. So some people are strong in one area. Their grammar might be very good, but they might not have a very wide range of vocabulary. They might have a good range of vocabulary, but their pronunciation may not be very good. They may be quite fluent. They may be able to speak very easily and continue speaking, but their grammar may have lots of mistakes. So you need to analyze your own performance in speaking and work out, where am I strong and where do I need to improve? You can do this by recording yourself, by asking your friends what they think about your speaking performance. You can imitate what you hear and try and improve your pronunciation in that way. But again, as I said with listening, the more words that you know, the better your performance will be. So I would always recommend learn more and more words, learn them in context, learn them in phrases, and also try and improve your accuracy in grammar.
Thank you, Don.
My pleasure.
Osman would like to know, what's the criteria for marking a writing test?
Well, I mentioned in speaking there were 4 criteria, and in the writing it is exactly the same. They are slightly different criteria. Some of them are the same, but there are 4 criteria. So the first criterion in writing is task achievement, task response. Do you answer the question? In other words, do you understand the question And can you answer that question clearly and fully? The second criterion is called coherence and cohesion. And in writing, that means, can you use paragraphs correctly? And can you write logically? Can you write with an introduction, a middle, and a conclusion? The third criterion is the same as in speaking. It's called lexical resource, your vocabulary. Do you have a range of words? Can you use English words naturally? And finally, in the writing, the last criterion is grammatical range and accuracy. It's the same as for speaking. Is your grammar accurate? Can you use longer sentences as well as short sentences? Can you create sentences that have some complexity in them? So they are the four basic criteria for writing.
Thank you, Don.
My pleasure.
I've got Jalal here who would like to know what is the ideal IELTS score for those persons who want to start master degree in one foreign country.
Well, that will depend on the university that someone is going to. I don't know exactly what different courses, what different master's courses require, but I do know as a general rule, the more linguistically demanding a course is, that means the amount of English that you need to use, the more demanding that course is, the higher your IELTS score has to be. So, for example, if you were doing a master's in a law faculty, they would expect you to get at least a band 7 or even more in your IELTS. If, however, it was in the engineering faculty, in IT or something like that, the requirements may be something less. I would recommend that you get in touch with the university that you want to go to and ask them, and they will tell you. And very often it may be that they will say an overall IELTS score is required with no band lower than 6 or 7. Okay, Sarah?
Great, thank you so much. Jesse, tips about reading, please.
Tips about reading. Well, reading is, I think, the basis of success in all parts of IELTS. When you read, you're given a chance to analyse the language. You have a chance to quietly and at your own pace analyse sentences, to look at words, to get a picture of what those words and those sentences look like. If you read regularly, this will improve your listening, your writing, your speaking, as well as your reading. Tips for the reading section are basically these. Read. And when you do read, make sure that you read something that is similar to the sort of reading you will find in an IELTS reading test. I often tell people that the sort of reading that you find in an academic reading test is something like you would find in a serious news magazine. A news magazine where people are giving their opinion or where people are giving information about a particular topic. In the IELTS reading, it'll be a little bit simpler than in those magazines like The Economist magazine or a newspaper like The Guardian or in Australia, The Age newspaper. That's the sort of topic that you'd find in a reading test, slightly simplified. But when you read that sort of material, you'll also see that there are recurring patterns, that the pattern of writing is very similar in all of these things. So do that, do it regularly, make note of new words, but also read things that you enjoy, like read novels, read all sorts of things, popular magazines, anything. As long as you read and as long as you attend to the structure and the form of words, then this will improve your reading.
Great, thank you again. Hassan asking, I have heard that IELTS listening and speaking is much harder the real-life English, especially for people from subcontinent?
Well, Asan, it's not really true. In real life, you have a great variety of English that you hear, that you have to use when you speak. In IELTS, of course, this variety is reflected, but very often it will be simplified. In the listening test, you will not be asked to listen to a very, very complex bit of listening. In the reading, you won't be asked to read anything really complex. In the speaking, and this is very important, in the speaking, in the IELTS speaking test, you are able to actually ask the examiner for clarification. So you can say to the examiner, "I'm sorry, what does that word mean?" Or, "Can you repeat that, please?" This is something that the IELTS speaking test has that is unique, and that means that it helps you improve your score in the speaking. So don't think that IELTS speaking and listening and reading and writing are more difficult than what you do in the real world. They reflect the real world, and usually they are slightly simplified.
Great. Pardip, asking for how much time it takes to make myself prepare for IELTS.
Well, Pardip, that's a very interesting question. How long is a piece of string? That's an English idiom, by the way. In other words, it's impossible to tell. If you are at a band 4, for example, quite low, you can improve very quickly. You could become a band 5 within 6 months. If, however, you are at a band 7, to get to a band 8 might take you another year. There is what we call a plateau. When you reach around about a band 6 or a 6.5, it's quite difficult to move from being an intermediate user of English to go much beyond that very quickly. Of course, you can. And I know people who are not native speakers of English who have achieved band 9 in IELTS, but it's taken them a lot of time, and it's taken them a lot of hard work. So if you're prepared to be realistic and take your time and to work hard and practice every day, then the sky is the limit.
Great. Another question from Sami. What about verbal reasoning?
Sammy's asking about verbal reasoning. Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Sammy. Reasoning is important, being logical, because that is assessed in your writing. If you are incoherent, that means you are not sounding logical or reasonable, and that will affect your score in writing and a little bit in speaking. It doesn't really affect things like listening and reading. Perhaps, Sammy, you're talking about what you are asked to read in the reading test, where someone is making an argument and they are giving reasons for what they believe. This is one of the things that you will have to read in a reading test. So I would recommend that you read those things that I suggested before, serious news magazines and newspapers, to get some experience of that.
Thanks, Don. Benzish would like to know, will there be any difference in IELTS score based on which country exam is taken? She's in Australia now and need 7 each. Was in dilemma whether to take test here or back home in Nepal.
Okay, so this is Binzesh from Nepal. Does it matter where you take the test? Well, it doesn't. The test is the same test wherever you take the test. It's the International English Language Testing System. I'll give you an example. If you did the test last Saturday on the 29th or 27th, whatever it was, of October, that test was exactly the same test that was delivered in Japan or in New Zealand, in that time zone, in that group of countries, within those time zones. The reading was the same, the listening was the same, and the writing tasks were all the same. For the speaking, you will have had different examiners, of course, and sometimes those examiners will have been living in Nepal for a long time, or they might have been living in Australia for a long time, or somewhere else. But every one of those examiners is trained in exactly the same way, with exactly the same materials, and they are all monitored in exactly the same way. They are all expected to examine to a standard which has been set worldwide. So the test is the same in all parts of the world, and we do everything in our power to make sure that everybody gets exactly the same chance.
Great, thanks. Who would like to know what's a good way to research evidence for modern issues such as education and health for academic writing task 2?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, because it brings up the question of topics in speaking, in writing, but also in reading. There are particular topics that recur, and these sorts of topics are the things that people, educated people, are interested in worldwide. You may not be interested in things like education or the economy. You may not be interested in the environment or globalization. But these are topics which any educated person is expected to have an opinion about. And I would recommend, as a first step for everybody listening today, that they become familiar with these topics. That means becoming familiar with the sorts of words that are used when we discuss these topics, becoming familiar with the sorts of arguments which are used when discussing these topics. And if you do that, then you will have an advantage when you do the IELTS writing test, the reading test, or the speaking test. So again, go back to those news magazines, watch current affairs programs on TV, talk to people about these sorts of topics.
Thanks, Don.
It's always a pleasure, Sarah.
Thank you.
You're doing a very good job
Thank
too,
you
by
so
the way.
much. Pretty asking, is the topic of writing task 2 similar in both academic and general?
That's a good question. Was that pretty?
Yes.
Well, it's different. In the academic writing task 1, you are always asked to describe a graph or a chart or a diagram of some description, perhaps 2 maps. It could be a process. This is the task in academic task 1. In general training task 1, however, you are always asked to write a letter. And this letter is quite simple. You are told who to write to, you are told what to write about, and you are told 3 or 4 points that you should cover in your letter. In task 2, however, for academic writing and in general training writing, this is very similar. Task 2, remember, is the most important part of the written test. It's 2/3 of the mark. In both academic and general training, you are asked to give your opinion on a topic, and you're given a statement. Many people believe this, and then you are asked to respond. To what extent do you agree? Or discuss this? Do the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, etc.? So that type of essay is exactly the same for both academic and general training in task 2.
Thank you. Salim would like to know, he's actually asking any tips to get higher score band in listening.
Well, Salim, I think I've covered that to a degree. In order to improve your listening score, you really do need to listen a lot. You do need to improve your vocabulary a lot. You do need to get practice with different accents. You do need to concentrate from the very first moment, because in the listening test, you only hear the recording once. If you lose concentration and miss a couple of questions, you know what's going to happen. You're going to not score that 35 or 36 or 37 that you want to get a band 8. So make sure that you concentrate from the very start, improve your vocabulary every day, and practice listening. And you can do this online every day as well. Sarah?
Thank you. Aziz is asking how to improve pronunciation of English for IELTS.
So Azaz Khan has asked about pronunciation. So I would say that pronunciation is one of the big problems for many people. English pronunciation is difficult if you come from a culture that uses tones like Chinese or Vietnamese. It's difficult to pronounce English well. If you come from another culture which is similar to English, like Spanish or French, then it's not such a problem. But really what you must do is look at your pronunciation, analyze it very carefully, and think, where do I need to improve? Now, if, for example, your first language is Vietnamese, you will very often leave off the end of a word. This is something you need to practice, making sure that you finish the word, ending the word. If you come from another sort of culture which does not have the sorts of inflections and intonation that English has, and you speak in a monotone, then you need to practice putting this colour into your voice, as I'm doing now, to say that this is important, but that is not important. That's called intonation. You may come from a culture where people speak in a very rapid manner, where there is a lot of what we call elision, where words blend into the next word. We do this in English, but not all the time, so you might have to slow down a little bit. I recommend that you record yourself, ask somebody if they can understand what you're saying, ask native speakers if you can for their advice, but also go online, listen to a good example of someone speaking, perhaps a podcast, and imitate. You can do this quite easily. You can get the transcript of what they're saying, and with your pen, underline the words that are emphasized. With your pen, make a stroke where people pause. In this way, you are writing down visually what you hear, and in this way, you can imitate what you hear and improve your pronunciation.
Thanks, Don.
My pleasure, Sarah.
And Pradeep as well says, thank you, Don.
Thank you.
Okay, and here's this question. For how much extent movies or videos can help me to improve my speaking and listening skills?
Well, I think that they can improve your speaking and listening a lot. Remember, if you're listening to a movie, you will not hear every word. You won't. It's very quick. You won't be able to understand everything. But don't worry about that. The more you listen, the more you will understand, and the more you'll be able to pick up some idiomatic language, some very natural language. This is a very big advantage in IELTS. The more naturally you can use words in your speaking test and also in your writing test, then the better score you will get for lexical resource. That's the vocabulary section. But you don't just listen to a movie, you don't just watch a movie once. I suggest that you watch this movie a lot. The more you look at the same thing, the more you will understand. Use the pause button, rewind, listen again. Try and imitate what you hear. Write down what you hear. Check with your friends if you've written it down correctly. Be analytical about language, and the more you are, then the better your performance will be in IELTS.
Great. Back to Priti, she's saying thank you, and her exam is today.
Oh, well, good luck.
Best of luck. I have Anil again. Reading part, definitely a tough task to finish in the given time. Paragraphs with typical words definitely needs time to answer the right answers.
Yes, well, that is the problem with reading. You're asked to read something like 2,500 words in 1 hour only. If you had 2 hours, it would be quite easy. But the reason that we make it a short test, relatively short test, is to test how quickly you can read and understand. So this means you need to practice reading quickly. How many people do that? Maybe not enough. Tonight, why don't you start practicing reading quickly? Look at a page of text from a magazine, maybe online, maybe a paper magazine, and say, I'm going to read this page in 1 minute. Of course, this is a difficult thing to do. But if you take these tips, maybe this will help you. Don't read every word. Don't read every sentence. Maybe read 2 or 3 sentences in each paragraph. Maybe don't even read every paragraph. Make sure that you concentrate on the first part of the passage and the last part of the passage, because that will give you an idea of what it's all about. You don't need to understand everything perfectly, but you do need to get a good general idea of what you're reading. Now, this is called skimming. If you practice skimming, this is a skill that will benefit you in the reading test, because it will speed up your ability to find the right answer. Remember, in the reading test, the answers usually come in the same order as the questions. So if you find the answer to question 1, you know that the answer to question 2 will come after that, fairly soon after that. That answer to question 1 might be 300 or 400 words into the passage. That means you've saved yourself some time, because you don't have to read that first 300 or 400 words very closely. I think you're asking about matching headings to paragraphs, this particular type of question in the reading, and this is a difficult type of question. My advice to you there is to begin with the shortest paragraph first, because this is probably the easiest one to match to a heading. See the frequency of a particular word in that paragraph. This might give you a hint as to which heading is most suitable. And lastly, don't be afraid to change the headings. If you've put one heading on a paragraph and you find later on that maybe another paragraph matches that heading better, then change it.
Thanks, Don. Vinit says, hello, Don.
Hello.
I need your help. Please guide me to improve my reading scores in writing. In writing, I usually score 6 or 6.5. Which book can I go through to achieve 7 in writing and reading? So please help me. Thanks in advance.
Right, so reading and writing, what books can you use for preparation? Well, we mentioned already the official practice materials that you can get from IELTS Essentials, and also other practice materials on that website. I don't really have any titles to give you, but I do know that the books that Cambridge University Press produce are generally very good. There is a good book called Action Plan for IELTS by a well-known writer in Australia, a woman called Claire McDowell. That's a good book that I've used with my students in the past as well. But if you go to any English language, teaching English as a second language bookshop, then you'll find a huge variety, and I would suggest you just look at them and see which one you think is going to be useful to you and try it out. I can't really recommend any other titles to you directly, but begin with the IELTS Essentials website and check out the Action Plan for IELTS 2, which is a Cambridge University Press book.
Great. And last question, Don, from Manbrit, who's asking, how can I improve speaking score?
So again, how can you improve your speaking score? Well, look at the descriptors, look at the 4 assessment criteria, and work out which part is weak for you, which part you need to improve. Remember, those 4 criteria. The first one is fluency and coherence. That means, can you continue to speak without too much effort? This is something you can practice. And one of the secrets to being able to keep talking is to have words and phrases that you can use to connect your ideas. Words and phrases like this. Well, of course, I imagine, I suppose, that's an interesting question, I'm not sure how to answer that, etc. These little phrases are the sorts of phrases that a native speaker of any language would use, and they are the phrases that help you become fluent. Don't speak too quickly, don't speak too slowly. The second criterion, lexical resource, simply means, do you have a lot of words? And this is something you need to work on every day. Make a list of new words, revise them every day, make sure that you use them every day. Remember, one word in isolation is not much use. Learn groups of words, phrases, so that you can use these phrases in particular contexts. This will help your fluency as well. The third criterion, the grammar, grammatical range and accuracy. Learn some particular structures that you can use very easily. For example, if constructions. If I were the government, I would do this. If the government had done this in the past, something would have happened. These are different types of conditional sentences, but you can practice these. And if you practice them and become very confident in using them, then that will help you in your fluency and also in your grammatical range. And finally, pronunciation. Work out which parts of your pronunciation are not clear and make them clear. Okay? That's how you would improve.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. The last question is from me. Any other last tips for people taking IELTS listening soon?
Well, if you're going to take the listening soon, I would suggest you spend a lot of time listening to English, okay? Don't just be using your own language all the way up until the test. Make sure that you are using a lot of English, listening to a lot of English, speaking a lot of English in the days and weeks before the test. That will help you. Well, that's our last question, so
Yes.
I think we'll finish now.
Great. Thanks for everyone. Please watch Don in 2 weeks for another live. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank Don.